Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. This is Tim Collins again, Secretary General of World Stainless, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar entitled Can Stainless Steels Compete with Plastics? Before we get into the webinar itself, just a few points of note from a housekeeping type perspective. Firstly, the presentation will be shared with all attendees, so you don't have to ask that as a specific question. Everybody will get a copy of the presentation. Secondly, in terms of questions, we'd like people to pitch questions via the chat function, which you should have available on your screen. And we probably won't have time to answer all questions during the webinar itself. However, all questions pitched will be answered. So anything we don't get answered today in the webinar, I will respond to via email. And of course, supplementary questions after the webinar, you may email us at World Stainless or indeed myself directly, and you'll get a reply as well. So the process can continue. It's not just the hour today. Now, in terms of timing, I'm going to speak for around 45 minutes, leaving time for questions. And in the midst of the webinar, we do have a short video, which Joe Class, who's assisting me with the webinar today, will run when we get to the appropriate point in the presentation. I'd just like to ask Joe, though, if the audio quality is good before we start moving through the slides. Joe, can you hear okay?
I can hear everything perfect, Tim.
Perfect, thank you. So let's move forward. So today's agenda, we have 6 elements and then a summary at the end. So we'll have a small introduction, then a little bit of a history lesson. Then we'll briefly reflect on some common uses of plastics and stainless steels, and I think most people know many. Then I'll give my take on what I've described as the plastics dilemma before moving into, well, why the hell would you choose stainless steels? And then we'll look at comparing materials, the 2 groups of materials in different applications before summarizing at the end. So, a little bit of an introduction, and I think it's fair to say that both plastics and stainless steels were invented around the same time in the early 1900s. Bakelite, the first sort of fully synthetic plastic, in 1907, and the first commercial stainless steel cast in 1913, so 6 years apart broadly. Should equally be recognized that the notion of synthetic polymers or synthetic materials was not brand new at that point. There was something attempted in 1869. However, it was not quite 100% synthetic. So just want to make reference that, you know, the development of plastics is quite old in that context. And it's equally fair to say that both groups of materials have supported some amazing things and have been things of necessity in many cases. Our society has evolved, whether it be computers and cell phones that we all love and hate in equal measure today, to more important things like medical equipment, clothing, and even body armor from a plastics perspective, and stainless. You know, the general healthcare of our society would not have taken some of the leaps forward without the use of stainless in household appliance, surgical instruments, and equipment for safe processing of food and drinks. We rely so heavily on stainless steels in those areas. So a little reflection of some of the really important things in our society. And equally, there is no doubt that over the last 100 years or so that these products have been around, the demand has consistently grown. So there's a shared element there too. But also there's some really interesting differences when you look at the tonnage of material produced. So plastics approach about 400 million tons on an annual basis now, and it's hard to define, but around half of that is reported to be single-use plastics, and that's clearly an area of concern that most people would recognize. By contrast, stainless is much smaller, around 50 million tons or a little over that produced annually. So we're talking, when you consider the relative densities of these products, a huge amount of plastic things and a smaller amount of stainless steel things. What's interesting is when you get to look at the recycling credentials as a start, almost all stainless steels are recycled at the end of life. The capture system within the recycling world is very strong and capable. So 95% of global stainless steels are recycled at the end of their life. Human manufacturing, we were very inventive. Plastics, just 9% at a global level are recycled, and a further 18% incinerated for power, which of course is okay as well. But that equally means that almost 3/4 of plastics are not what I would call appropriately disposed of at the end of their life. And in many cases, if we think that a lot of plastics are single use, that's a short life compared to stainless steel, because when you correctly specify a stainless steel for an application, it will provide a service life in excess of 100 years. And equally, what's really important and interesting is you'll get that service life with either very low or in some cases, zero maintenance. So having set the scene, let's start with a little history. And I think we have to, and this depends on where you start in the world as well, we have to sort of reflect on two sort of important guys, Leo Baekeland and Harry Brearley, who were both sort of recognized as being the sort of pioneers of the respective industries. But if we start with a simple timeline, and I'm not going to include sort of everything in this timeline, these are just a few interesting highlights. But of course, as we said, Bakelite came in, invented in 1907, followed a few years later by Harry Brearley's first commercial cast of stainless steel. It's equally fair to say that other people were developing other stainless steels around that time, 1912, 1913, 1914. In the 1920s, stainless steel was first used to store an acid, nitric acid, which has become a common sort of use of stainless steel over the last 100 years or so. The early 1930s saw the first duplex stainless steel created in Sweden, and duplex stainless steels are a high strength stainless steel, so have many useful applications, particularly in building and infrastructure. In the 30s, we got plexiglass and nylon being invented, which I think we all recognize and know so well in our society. In the 1950s, the notion of argon oxygen decarburization, which I'm not even going to describe the process in this webinar today, was invented. And that was the enabler for mass production of stainless steel. So you can see, interestingly there, it took until the 1950s for stainless to move from what I would describe as a cottage industry to mass production. By the 60s, plastic production at a global level hit 10 million tons. And in the 1970s, we shouldn't ever forget this, certainly sort of older people like me, that plastic water bottles became quite sexy because they were promoted on catwalks by models. And that was very prominent in the rise of the use of bottled water. By the 1980s, so 21 years later, stainless steels reached global production of 10 million tons. And by 1999, this is a staggering statistic, so just before the turn of the century, global plastic production reached 200 million tons. So a huge step up from the 1960s. And just to reflect on those last few years, leaving the last two references in place, by 2019, global plastic production approached 400 million tons. So in relatively few years, 20 years, the production had almost doubled. And in that same time, stainless production reached 52 million tons. So some quite staggering differences. But what's interesting to reflect against that sort of growth in production and consumption, 70 or so years ago, the global population was 2.5 billion people, and now we have almost 8 billion people. And over half of those live in urban settings. So when you have the bulk of your people living in urban environments, it shouldn't be a surprise that demand for things like plastics and stainless steels have both increased quite dramatically over the last 70 or even 100 plus years. And here's the sort of charts that demonstrate what I've said, and you can see the amazing sort of ramp up of plastics compared to stainless steels. Both have been growth industries. Plastics has more leveled out in the last few years, but I think we probably understand why some of that has occurred. But what's interesting, another reflection, just looking over this 70-year time horizon, the urban population has increased by 3.2 times, and yet what I would class as unsustainable materials production has exceeded that. So it's an interesting reflection. What has driven our society, even though the population has grown, to adopt materials that aren't naturally reused and recycled? So let's now just reflect for a moment on a few common uses of plastics and stainless steels. And it would be unfair if I didn't include the famous Lego brick in this. I think we've all enjoyed and suffered from treading on Lego bricks in the middle of the night. But healthcare without plastics, waste collection, pipe work, crates for moving material around, food containers, which I'll touch on a little later, packaging materials, and even storage vessels. Many uses of plastic that we see in our everyday life, and probably we don't even bat an eyelid, as I would say, as we walk past these things. These are everyday uses that are commonplace, we're familiar with. If we equally reflect on stainless, some things here you will recognize and some maybe less common. I mean, kitchenware and appliances is fine. We all recognize that. Process plant as shown in the bottom left-hand corner of this slide. Medical equipment, fairly common. Cutlery we know about, but reinforcing bar for construction, it's starting to grow in its use. It's still, stainless products are still only less than 1% of total steel usage in construction, but is growing. We now start to see the introduction of food containers, rail cars, pipework again. And there are some clear overlaps or duplication that stainless and plastics can be used for very similar things. But I'd now like to move on to talk about what I call the plastics dilemma. And the question I'm pitching here is, are we going from useful to harmful? And you see the sort of nice presentation of food in a plastic container on the left and a lake littered with plastic debris on the right. And I guess we see examples of this, certainly the picture on the right, on our news broadcasts week in, week out. It doesn't go away at the moment. But we need to sort of think back a little. And there's no doubt that World War II necessitated a great expansion of the plastics industry because so many things could just not be developed by dragging things out of the earth. So this drove the development of plastics, and it equally didn't constrain human manufacturing. We were very inventive in that period. And the ability to make new materials and products was really important for the development of our society. And these products were often inexpensive and considered as safe and hygienic. And maybe we're reflecting on those latter 2 points in more recent times. But back in the sort of late 30s and into the 40s, this was how things were considered. But we have to recognize that the source of most of the plastics relies on fossil fuels, and particularly the carbon atoms and building those polymerized chains. And ultimately, that would become an environmental red flag for our society. And I think it's probably very fair to say, and I've got a spelling mistake in this line at the bottom, which any of you sort of sharp-eyed people will notice, our planet really cannot sustain the amount of virgin consumption we are and have been used to. So we have to sort of make some changes. I think that's really fair to say. But just a little reflection, I couldn't resist this picture, and it's nothing, this is nothing to do with me, even though the surname is the same. But I remember as a young boy growing up in the sort of late 1960s and into the 70s, all the milk and juices came to our homes in reusable glass bottles, and we diligently washed them out and leave them out, and they were collected. But I don't remember my parents ever asking for that to change. They were very happy with that. What drove that change to plastic containers available through supermarkets? I've gone back to glass bottles being delivered by a vehicle similar to this, more advanced. But hey, the notion of electric vehicles existed then. All the deliveries that I remember as a small boy were electric milk carts. And it's interesting that times are sort of moving round. But that's just a little reflection on, I think, a society many of us may remember. But going back to the notion of the plastics dilemma, pretty much all plastics are produced from fossil fuels today. There are bioplastics coming on board, but it's relatively modest. And if you try and sort of say, well, how much of these are single use? There's many reports out there, but about half seems to be the common view. An interesting reflection is if you look at street litter, most urban settings would say now 4 out of 5 or 80% of that street litter is single-use plastics, primarily associated with fast foods. And I think it's also well recognised that in not too far into the future, by 2040, we'll have more plastic items in our oceans compared to fish. And that's a worrying statistic for anybody. Equally, humans ingest quite a significant volume of microplastics in their lifetimes. And whilst that's proven, some of the outcomes are not yet, but that's another worrying feature. So is this the world we really wanted to create, where we've got all these sort of other proportions? But that is the fact that what I class as out of sight disposal of materials, does that adversely affect our lifestyle choices? Are we conditioned because we don't see what happens at the end of life to certain materials? So let's just reflect now on the sort of global annual disposal routes for plastic waste. And this is OECD data, it's not my data. And this waterfall chart builds to approaching 400 million tonnes, as you'll see in the right. But you can see here where stuff's going, with the biggest category standing out as landfill, which we all see again in news broadcasts, some incinerated in open land, the red box, and some dumped to oceans. And there is some not accounted for in this, and I guess in the not accounted, it all goes into the other proportions, but that's relatively small. But this is quite a frightening sort of picture when you sort of consider it from that perspective. And, you know, I think we all try to segregate plastic waste into waste bins sitting at the end of our gardens or the end of our sort of roads. But even if we're doing that and we're very diligent about it, the recycling isn't happening. What's more worrying is perhaps the cost per tonne of these different routes. And this data is taken from a couple of sources that, you know, broadly give the same sorts of numbers. And what I've included here in the big blue boxes on the right-hand elements of this chart are the environmental cost. So the cost over time, this has been calculated or determined over 100 years of waste plastics, but we know they linger around much, much longer than that. But this is just to give an interesting reference, which I'll come on to in a moment, to the cost of disposal of stainless steels. So even recycling is quite costly, and incineration a little less costly, but obviously gives something back in terms of power. And then the other things, the straight incineration in open land, landfilling and dump to oceans, creates ongoing environmental costs that at the minute we don't necessarily see an end of those costs. So some of these costs will only get worse over time unless we do something very drastic. And if you average that data set for plastics, left-hand bar, and compare it to stainless steels, right-hand bar, you see a staggering difference. And of course, for stainless steels, we have a very mature recycling collection and recycling system. Plastics, as you've seen from the earlier data, is not like that. So we do have that benefit. Stainless steels are also much more dense than plastics. So things like transport costs are much lower because you can move a lot of metal for much less money compared to something that's very light and difficult to compact in the same way. So there's some obvious things, but again, the environmental element is still highly dominant in this. And this is the frightening feature, that this element of the costs for things that are not recycled are almost hidden, but are there. So, as I've said, much of the cost of plastics in our society are hidden. We see them as cheap, lightweight, and useful, and there's no doubting they are. We can't argue with that. But I would argue they come with some serious warnings. And that's not to say the plastics industry have, I think since the 1950s, offered recycling solutions for their materials. So I don't think we should be criticizing the plastics industry necessarily here, because they know as an industry how to recycle plastics, but very little, as we've seen, is recycled. We create in plastic products disposable products that ultimately live forever in our environment. So the overall outcome is far from positive because of the way plastics are being used. Not that plastics used appropriately are necessarily bad, but in the way they are today, they are not a fully sustainable material compared to other things that are well recycled. So, having been a little provocative in that last section, why the hell would you choose stainless steels? And there's some interesting reflections on stainless steel items again here. But let's have a quick reflection, because people will say, well, hey, why the hell should I be choosing stainless steels when, firstly, hey, they're expensive compared to other materials. They're heavy when made as a packaging or even a lifestyle type product. It can be an illogical choice for fast food applications because you can't stick a stainless steel container in a microwave oven, and indeed you can't. But I think we have to overlook some of those things. And stainless steel, hey, the steel industry is a dirty industry. Well, that's a perception. Steel generally has quite a low carbon footprint, and when you start recycling things, the carbon footprint drops even further. So we have to keep things in context. But of course, people remember, and often movies and things show industry as a dirty looking sort of set of factories, and the smokestacks kicking out all sorts of awful things is what people have in their minds. But the industry has changed. So, thinking about why we would choose stainless steels, I'm going to use to illustrate this the fast food type container. And you see two very nice examples of segmented containers in plastic on the left, stainless steel on the right. So I'm going to start with costs. And because we are an association, we can't talk absolute costs in this context. We've got to talk relative costs. And I'm using three types of materials here: single-use, SU, single-use plastic, reusable plastic, and stainless. And if we attach a relative product cost, this is for the container, of 1 to the single-use plastic, then a reusable plastic will be around 4 times more expensive, and stainless 28 times more expensive. So hey, suddenly you're saying, wow, that's a huge difference, and indeed it is. But if you then add to that the relative environmental cost, you see quite a big difference here. Single-use plastics carry a significant environmental cost, and these costs are often hidden, and we end up paying them indirectly. This is the go to visit places, they're tourist type taxes or local taxes and charges to use it to gather, I should say, and sort of process and even ship out plastics. There are costs already applied to products, lots of hidden things in there that we don't see but end up paying indirectly. So if you put those two things together and plot them as lines as shown in the chart, the single-use plastic and the reusable plastic start very low on that chart at use number 1, and the x-axis here is number of uses. But what you see is over time, things quickly change because the stainless product doesn't change. It can be reused over and over again. So if you get into that mode of thinking and that mode of reusing a stainless container, then it is better. Even the reusable plastic container is better. It takes 15 uses before stainless becomes the break-even sort of attractive offer. So it's an interesting reflection, but the story doesn't end there. It's equally interesting to look at emissions. So if we look at 1 gram of polypropylene, which is what is typically used for many of these plastic containers, producing that emits about 1.7 grams of CO2. 1 gram of stainless steel is a little higher, 2.2 grams. So you say, hey, these numbers are not so far apart. However, a single-use polypropylene container only weighs just over 9 grams, and a reusable stainless food container weighs a whopping 475 grams. So if you then convert the emissions into per container, a single-use plastic container, almost 16 grams of CO2, a stainless container, 1,045 grams. So we see a significant difference here, and people will be saying, hey, that's not so good. However, if you think about the number of uses of a plastic container, when you get to 67 plastic containers, the total emissions exceeds the reusable stainless steel container. So 67 uses is an interesting number, and I'll come to this now, because assessing the use of fast food containers, the global average number of fast food containers used per person per year is 135, and 67 is almost half of that in simple terms. So that's an interesting reflection, that if you choose the stainless container and you are an average person, and I know we're not all average, after 6 months, the stainless container has a better environmental footprint. And the known life of 1 reusable stainless steel food container currently stands at 750 reuses, and we're still counting. That's proven. That's been work undertaken over the last few years, but it's still going, and we will keep developing this. I don't see any reasons why the stainless container can't exceed 1,000 uses with no problems at all. So the emissions reflection is a slightly different perspective, but this notion of life cycle, or usage in this case, thinking, I think is really important. So why? Because people will say, well, hey, the life cycle cost or the usage cycle cost is much lower compared to alternative materials. And we have to think in this way. The environmental impact is highly positive because you're not remaking things. They offer the best recycling rate of all man-made materials. Stainless steels and general steels are up there. Aluminium is probably second, but some 20 percentage points below the steel category. Hygienic and safe products. Stainless steels meet all global food and drink contact material standards. In fact, they are the only material that satisfy all the standards all of the time. As I've said, they have a very long service life and a high reuse rate. We know more than 750 uses is easy. These things are really easy to clean. Steel container in a microwave are inert. They don't have any impact on life forms, the environment, on foods. You know, nothing comes off these, and that's because they're protected. And I didn't say this at the start, by an invisible passive film. And the passive film materials are essentially stainless steel, aluminium and its alloys, and titanium and its alloys. And when you've got a passive film that protects the surface, you have a very hygienic product. So let's move on now and compare materials in different applications. So first, just a quick reflection on fast food containers, but with a new twist. Because I've explained already the benefit of choosing stainless for fast food containers, but we know now that legislation is hitting us to eliminate the use of single-use plastics. And in Canada, their legislation hits on the 28th of March, so not long away. And an example from Montreal is that the prohibition that kicks in formally on the 28th of March is for many single-use plastics for food and drinks use, and that's covering both packaging and distribution directly to customers. So it's really interesting. And as a result of that, and I'm just going to describe quickly an organisation called Returnsy, which are now established in Canada. They offer this complete system for collecting containers, renting them out, washing them, presenting them back to restaurants and takeaway outlets. And you'll see in the lower middle of this slide, there is a link to the Returnsy video. We're not going to show that one today. That's for you guys to look at your leisure when you get the presentation. But I am going to ask Joe at this point to sort of kick in and sabotage my presentation and show another example that's also from Canada, because their legislation is kicking in, because there are many of these companies springing up. So Joe, would you like to take control at this point? I can't hear anything at the minute. Thanks, Joe. So that was just another example beyond Returnsy. And as I've said, Canada is embracing this change quite quickly now, and I'm sure that will ripple out to other countries. Joe, is my audio still okay? So we've clicked back.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Okay, so moving forward, the second example is water supply pipe work, and many people will be familiar as they've travelled around, particularly cities and their sort of suburban areas, seeing workmen digging up water pipes and fixing things or sort of reinstalling things. It's common to see this in our world, but hey, does it have to be? And here's an example of a stainless steel water pipe that runs on the left-hand side from the water mains pipe. They are generally made from cast iron to the water meter at the property. And the interesting thing about this is a stainless steel partially corrugated tube, which can be bent by hand. So you don't have any joints, and that's really interesting, which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, let's start with the headline numbers. People may not realise that on average across the world, 30% of treated water never reaches the point of consumption. That's the homes, the offices and other businesses. So something is being processed and never gets to the point of consumption. And most of that water is lost due to leakages in the supply network. And the bulk of those leakages occur in the last meters of the supply pipe, what is known as the service lines between the water mains and the properties as shown on that previous image. And why do these leakages occur? Well, essentially, if you're using plastic pipework, you've got too many joints, you can't flex it in the same way, and that primary material, the plastic, is not resilient enough for the purpose for which it is intended. Now, here's just a reflection of treated water losses in a selection of major cities. I could have put any range of cities on here, it would have shown the same profile. What's interesting is you've got a few very well-performing cities on the left, and you've got progressively poorer performance as you move to the right. And the dark green line is the world-class water loss proportion that's achieved using stainless steel pipework. So you would say, hey, why are people not doing this? Well, that's an interesting question. But let's start with plastic pipework. It's not as resilient, as I've said, as you expect. And one of the problems with plastic pipework is that many of the leaks, particularly when they're small, are what I'd term silent. It's difficult to hear them, and they're underground, of course. But within the industry, material acquisition costs drive material selection. So upfront costs are driving choice of materials rather than whole of life costs. And equally, we hide the failures by burying pipework underground. And when you think about it in those terms, it probably becomes quite an interesting reflection. If you've got something that is not resilient and you hide it, you're just hiding your problems. So what's the solution? If leakages from plastic pipeworks and their fittings, the joints are the problem, what's the solution? So I would argue it's flexible stainless steel pipes and fittings. Take the fittings away or minimize them and have a flexible system. So as I've said, you can bend these things. You don't have to have fittings to navigate corners. And if you're going to stick something in the ground that you can't see, you really need something that's going to work day after day, year after year. You need this notion of fit and forget rather than install and repair. And several major cities in the world have already switched to stainless, and the results are amazing, really stunning. So I'm going to use an example here from the city of Seoul in South Korea. And this is a timeline from the early 90s to 2014. 3 lines on this chart. The green line shows the proportion of stainless pipework in their system, which started low in the early 90s and progressed up to about 90%, which seems to be an interesting level. The number of repairs they had to carry out started around 45,000 per annum per year in the early 90s, dropping to 10,000 by 2014. And the leakage proportion was almost 30% at the start of this process, dropping to 2.5% at the end. So that looks impressive, but hey, some people will be saying, well, come on, show me the money. What's it all about? So here's the summary reflection. Leakages approaching 30%, down to 2.5%. Stainless proportion of service pipes progressively increasing, repairs falling. Look at that in repairs per day. You've gone from 125 down to 25 a day. Massive reduction in water treatment plants needed, massive reduction in CO2 emissions, and then the savings are staggering. Over that 22-year period, approaching $4 billion of financial savings. So that's 174 million US dollars per year. Now, this is one of several examples around the world, and the numbers are all similar and staggering. There is no doubt that this solution works and works well. You take away much of your headaches, much of your problems, and equally, you're not digging up roads and disrupting traffic. But let's just quickly reflect on another example, the city of Taipei in Taiwan, because they've gone through the same process. Similar amount of leakages, not quite as high. Back in 2002, 26%. They had another problem that year on year, because of climate change, the rainfall was reducing and their water reservoirs were actually being emptied. They had no water, and the water company then had to shut off water supply to the city. So this is a very extreme example of what was happening in Taipei. So they started to switch to the stainless steel service line, and once they got to a critical proportion, the reduced rainfall, which continued, meant the reservoirs were never empty because they weren't having leakages. So the continuous water supply was restored, the supply costs and emissions were reduced, and they even ended up with surplus water that could be sold to neighbouring utilities. And in this case, the maintenance cost savings were $111 million over 16 years, or $7 million per year. Of course, Taipei is a much smaller city compared to Seoul, but it's just a really interesting reflection of the magnitude of the benefits that you get from rethinking your material selection. So now I'd like to move on to another example, toiletries containers, and we're getting to the end of the presentation. So most people buy toiletries in plastic containers. We know about the refillable concept. It's been around for some time, but it's still embryonic. But you can find these refillable liquid toiletries bags in most major retail outlets, and they contain less plastic, which is a great start, but it's not enough, I would argue. And if we do the simple comparison here, the relative cost. So for a toiletries container, disposable plastic has a cost of 1, stainless much bigger, 25 in this example. The production emissions look as they did before, stainless really high compared to plastics. Expected number of uses is the same. After 3 months, the stainless refillable thing doesn't cost you any more. The plastic has increased, but it's still much less than the stainless. The emissions have overtaken after 3 months. The emissions by buying plastic toiletries containers every 1.5 weeks or something like that after 3 months has overtaken. But for the break-even cost, it's about half a year, about 26 weeks. So emissions come sooner in this than costs. That's different compared to the food containers. So just something to know. And just simple things, if you consider things like the drop resistance of the containers, the plastics often will not survive regular drops. So if you've got people who, for whatever reason, are prone to dropping things, and when you're in a shower, things are slippy, of course, the stainless container will survive those drops as well. So you get added benefits from changing your material, not just the benefits of costs and emissions. So there is no doubt that the convenience of plastic toiletries containers has influenced our behaviour, and also the fact that you can pick these things up with lots of other things that you buy has made the concept in our lives easier. But I would argue we have probably prioritised convenience over sustainability, and we have to rethink that approach. And is it really any harder to choose refillable, long-lasting containers? It's just a mindset switch. Once you start doing it, you keep doing it. And the costs and emissions evidence should encourage us to make that switch. And we just have to prioritize what we do for our planet over other things. It's quite simple. And you have to think, we're leaving a legacy here for our children. Will they really thank us if we don't do the right thing? We're the generation that can make a change and influence things. Let's do it. So lastly, I'd just like to sort of talk briefly about the events drinks containers. This is something I was personally involved in, and sort of applies to outdoor music events and festivals. They're big business, but every one of them creates a huge litter mountain. And I'm going to use Glastonbury in the UK as the example here. The organisers of the Glastonbury Festival had a dilemma. This goes back to 2016. It took 6 weeks to clear up the litter, and they had a team of people dedicated to this, doing it for 6 weeks after a 2 to 3 day event. And much of that litter was single-use plastics, essentially drinks containers. It's a summer festival, it's hot, so you get the picture. So their solution was to switch to stainless steel reusable containers. And what they did here, which is really interesting, was engrave the containers with the event details. So they created a souvenir item. And they charged €6 in sort of European terms for the containers, and sold 300,000 in about 48 hours. And that reduced their litter massively. So this was the start of a progression to use materials in an interesting way, actually sell these things along the way, because they were seen as a souvenir. So another dimension, another twist. And at the bottom, again, you can look at this in your own time, is a link to the Glastonbury video that was compiled to promote this concept. So I'd like to wrap up now. So plastics and stainless steels, no doubt, they've enhanced our society and our lives. But whilst almost all stainless steels are fully recycled, plastics sadly just aren't. And I've touched on the system's not effective for recycling, even though we think we're doing great things within our house environments, within our work environments. And our urban settings have become awash with much plastic litter. It's quite sad. And I would argue that I'm not blaming McDonald's as an organisation, but the notion of the McDonaldisation of our society has become the norm, and we need to break out of it. We need to reverse the situation, because we have to think about our children and our children's children. And whilst there is some legislation now that's helpful and appropriate, that's starting to kick in, we need to think. We need to demand change and not be just passive elements in this bigger system. So, can stainless steels compete with plastics? I think they can, not necessarily in all applications, but in many applications. And I think if you think about appropriate applications, single-use plastics, creating safe drinking water, etc., things like that, that's where stainless steels have the real role. Plastics still have a role, but we've got way too much of the wrong types of plastics in our society. And then we can benefit from lower emissions, lower costs. We have this increased impact that's positive on human and animal health. And we should think about being reusable, not replaceable. There's no doubt plastics waste as a problem is a dreadful societal outcome and feature, and we're responsible for that, so all of us to some degree. Stainless steels are a truly sustainable alternative. And we've got to get out of our heads this notion of being a throwaway society. Did we ask for this? Did we just adopt it? And I think our parents would be appalled by the world we've created. They were very frugal. They reused things. They resold things, and we seem to have moved away from those lessons. So at this point, I'd like to sort of say what we should do is think sustainably, think for a safe future, think stainless. And at that point, I'd like to thank everybody for their attention and say, hey, any questions? Joe?
Questions are popping in.
Good.
This question, have you included the logistics of collecting used stainless steel products in environmental impact calculations?
The collection of used stainless steel products is included in the calculation, but not in the environmental impact, because with 96% of end-of-life stainless steels being collected for recycling, and that level has been achieved at, it's almost a steady state level now over the last few years, the system is very mature. We know that we lose about 4% of stainless steels to essentially landfill. So there is a small environmental impact there, which is accounted for, but most of the transport of end-of-life stainless steel is through the recycling centres and back to the steel plants. So it is accounted for, but it's just important to make it clear how we've accounted for it.
And then the next question about I think it's about the food containers. It says, I think there is also another environmental cost and health risk for stainless steel applications in food industry. Has it been considered?
Well, stainless steel is widely used in the food industry, but not 100% of food and drink processing materials is stainless. And that's a dilemma for the industry, because stainless steel is the only material that satisfies all the legislation for food and drink processing. And whilst other materials satisfy some legislation and indeed are used, it is the combination of stainless and non-stainless that leads to, in these particular pieces of process plant that leads to some of the challenges, so bacterial pickup. And it all comes down to design. And you have to design food and drink processing plants to effectively be fully hygienic. And that demands a lot of challenges. And what we sadly find in the world is that much of that design of plant is ultimately ends up being a cost question. And so some shortcuts are made because people don't understand properly the hygiene. You don't have to you can't clean these bits of plant and process lines effectively, so there are no. If you're going to stick something in the ground that you harmful organisms, then you risk the next product run being contaminated. So there is a lot of work being undertaken by organisations like the European Hygienic Engineering Design Group, which supports the food and drink industry, to get them to update designs. Sadly, this industrial sector is not awash with material scientists, and to get things right, you have to really think about choice of materials and design effectively, and avoiding points of contamination that would harbour bacteria. So there is no doubt stainless works perfectly. I was at a food and drink conference just a couple of weeks ago, and everybody there from the industry said stainless is the only material that is perfect for our sort of processing application. Other materials are not bad, but they're not as universal as stainless. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, next question. Somebody is wondering how much microplastic is due to the plastic water piping?
That's a really good question, and I don't honestly know the answer to that. We know it occurs, particularly over time, because one of the features you have to sort of think about is that plastic pipework does get repaired and replaced. And when you start digging into the earth, you churn up debris, small stones and things that if they get into the pipework, and I'm sure that the workers do their very best to avoid contamination, but it's hard, they will chip away at the surface of the plastic. And that potentially will introduce microplastics. Equally, some of the treated water, I think, will allow microplastics to sort of effectively come off the surface. So there's lots of potential sources for microplastics, even just the fitting process in itself. I know people flush these things out, but how perfect are these operations when people are trying to work fast to restore supplies? So I generally don't know the answer, but I know it does create microplastics in our drinking water.
Next question. How to attract people to use stainless steel products? Because the price of stainless steel is high compared to the price of plastics.
It is, and that's one of the biggest hurdles. And I think we have to attack this on a number of fronts. One is that if you choose stainless for the right application and you can reuse that or use the stainless product over a long time, you will very much get a reduced cost. Because the notion associated with stainless is this notion of fit and forget. It will just keep working as long as you've got the right type of stainless steel for the right application. It's good for 100+ years. So it requires very little attention. And I think if you sort of thought about your own money, is it better to pay €10, $10 now and have nothing to pay in future times? Or is it better to pay $1 now and $1 next week and $1 the week after? How do we want to use our money and our material? And what I think you have to sort of reflect on as well is the state of the planet. If you keep paying the $1 every week and yet you create a huge hidden dilemma for the planet, is that really responsible compared to paying a little more here and now, or a chunk more in the case of stainless, but you don't have to worry thereafter because you know your product will keep being used or keep working, and you know it's fully recycled at its end of life. And that question of end of life is another issue. You know, we know that stainless steel lasts more than 100 years. There are some examples around the world, but how far can we go? The industry is only 110 years old, so we don't have this huge knowledge yet, but at least we know that our product can keep working year in, year out without very much intervention. So I think it's ultimately a personal choice, but you have to have some personal responsibility in this to make those choices. I think when you lay everything out in terms of life cycle costs or reuse costs, emissions, because we talk about production emissions, we don't so much talk about lifetime emissions. And for a building, for example, 75% of the emissions associated with the building are in its operational lifetime, not in the creation of the materials and the building of the structure. So you have to rethink your approach and have to have a bit wider knowledge to make appropriate choices. And I think that's part of this process that we're doing today, is sort of educating people that there is a different way of thinking. So I hope that's handled the question.
Next one, how would this change factor into the fast food industry without the packaging driving up the cost of the food per unit sale?
Well, in the example, the supply example we showed on the video, or the returnsy example, there is this notion of a deposit. Returnsy charge $9 Canadian for the use of their containers. And when you take the container back to one of their recycling points or return points, you can have the $9 back. So effectively, it's like a loan in that respect. But what you're doing is solving another problem in making that choice. So you're solving an environmental problem by making that switch. And $9 Canadian is somewhere between €5 and €6. And when you're paying significantly more for your food and you repeat that behavior every month, every week, whatever is your sort of personal preference, after a little bit of time, the magnitude of that €5 or €6 diminishes to almost nothing. So this is just about changing people's thought process on a different number of levels. One, if you want that $9 Canadian back or €5 or €6 back, you're entitled to it. You're not paying for this, you're paying a deposit, and we should sort of note that very well. But equally, over time, it becomes a negligible investment if you want to keep reusing the system. So I'd sort of argue that we have to change our mindset from convenience to responsibility.
Can we have one more question, I think?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Is curbside recycling available for stainless steels generally?
Curbside recycling. So I mean, I guess the collecting sort of urban litter. Well, what happens in the stainless industry, which is very mature, and it's the same in the general steel industry. There is a very well established collection system for almost all stainless steel waste, and these people diligently segregate into the different grades of stainless steel, and that supports the industry to produce new stainless steels from old stainless steels. Now, when you think about the stuff that is not captured through that system, which is about 4%, then there are organizations now that collect urban waste and are segregating all the elements out. And I've been to a couple in recent years that are now finding sort of small proportions of waste stainless in that larger urban waste. And the proportion is really small, but they are diligently segregating it. So closing this gap so we can get to almost 100%, the work is being undertaken. now, but it's a slow process because it's a very small proportion of urban or curbside waste. So I think what we have to do is, of course, close that gap and remove those losses as far as is practicable. But at what point does it become cost prohibitive? 4% is not a huge amount of the total scrap, but it's still worth capturing. So we've not sort of just ended the journey at 96% captured, but you do get into a more difficult environment. I'd love to see the other materials that are not as well recycled as the steel family reaching that above 90% mark. And, you know, aluminium's at 76. I think glass is at 20 something percent. Products that you think are recycled, they're not recycling, and plastics, as we said, down at 9%. So I think stainless is doing okay. There's a bit of work still to do, but the other industries do need to catch up.
Okay. It's 9:02 now, Tim. Do you want to take more questions, or?
I mean, I'm happy to take a couple more if people, you know, if people are interested. That's great. You know.
So there's a small remark, and then I'll say the question. Okay.
Sure.
So for the small and tiny items like drinking straws and coffee lids, maybe biodegradable plastic would be another best choice besides stainless steels. And
yes,
then,
I mean, sorry, yes, yeah. So
no, go on.
I think it's a really good point, and bioplastics are being developed for several applications, and I think that's right and proper.
And then it says, what is the blueprint for EU plastic ban policy?
Plastic, did you say banned, as in being banned?
Yeah, that's what I said.
Yeah, there is some legislation that's coming out, and I can't answer the question immediately now, but if the questioner would like a more thorough response, I'm happy to do that by email, because we've started to look at this and the legislation is coming out, but it seems to be country by country. So I'll check on that and we'll get a definitive answer if the questioner is happy with that.
As for the reusable boxes, how about the impact of cleaning the boxes, transporting the boxes? How about that?
Well, I factored that into the relative costs. So that's already been covered in the cost and the cost chart shown. However, what was perhaps not picked up from the little video is there was a deposit charge on the containers. And in the returnsy video that's linked to this, it's more explicit. And in Canada, it's between 9 and 10 Canadian dollars, which is about €5. And that covers the cost of doing all these things. Now, you might say, hey, that's quite a lot of money to sort of fork out, but it's a one-time only amount. And if you choose to say, I want to stop using this and give your container back, you get your 9 or 10 Canadian dollars back, no questions asked. So there is a service charge in there, but I factored it into the relative cost comparison. And after 5 uses, even with that service charge in, it still works. So we've covered that, but make no doubt about it, these companies do have to make money, and they can make money. The system, I think, is cost efficient and cost effective.
Is that also true for the environmental cost of the cleaning and the transportation?
Well, of course, what I think you have to understand, I know the lady in the video said, hey, you know, we can expand this to other cities. I think these arrangements have to be sort of fairly locally defined, otherwise you get excessive transport. But the returnsy system is slightly different to the supply system, because they encourage people to bring the containers back to either a deposit point in the city of Quebec, I think it is where returnsy is, or one of the restaurants or takeaway outlets. And they just take them and pass them back through the returnsy system, and they are sort of captured. So there are subtle differences in how these systems are being developed. And from a transport perspective, I think it is a good question, because what you don't want to happen is that you start to incur or create other emissions beyond what we have already. We should be about reducing emissions rather than creating more emissions. So there are some unanswered questions there, but I think the returnsy system, certainly based on the evidence I've seen so far, has thought about that in a smarter way than other emerging systems.
Thank you. Is there an extended producer responsibility on stainless steel?
I mean, stainless steels are ordered to national and international specifications that satisfy certain requirements. So if it's stainless steel for food and drinks containing purposes or processing purposes, in Europe it has to be aligned to the Council of Europe hygiene standards, which stainless steel meets by a long way. So the products are suitable for the application. There are certain stainless grades that you would not necessarily choose for food and drink applications, but the grades that you can deep draw into these containers are perfectly suitable and meet the required standards. And a couple of weeks ago, I went to a food and drink processing conference covering stainless steels, and some of the guys there made it very clear that stainless steels are the only material that satisfies all the varied conditions to which materials are exposed to in food and drinks processing from a hygiene and health and safety standard. So I think we're confident we have a product that meets the required standards now by a long way, and is well used and well recognized, and the industry producing food and drinks is very comfortable with stainless steels in this application.
Can you really hold the industry responsible for all of the litter and all of the plastics that are left behind everywhere?
I mean, that's an interesting question, because I'm sure that whatever industry you represent, including the plastics industry, they didn't encourage this waste to be created for 1 minute. And this is a human behavioral thing on a societal level. And I think we have to recognize that and not necessarily just say, hey, it's an industry problem. They created the materials and the products. We need to say this is a human problem that we've allowed to happen, and we need to be strong enough and bold enough and sort of lobby our administrations to make the appropriate changes. And I think, you know, banning the sort of use of single-use plastics is one, I think, useful feature, but it's not the only feature, because I think if you talk to people from the plastics world, they will say there are ways of recycling plastics, and you know, maybe the waste stream that has been easier to develop for metals needs to be looked at in a more helpful way for plastics. So I think we have to view this as a societal problem, not necessarily an industry problem.
So here we are comparing plastics with metal. So bear in mind all the benefits from stainless steels in the shown applications. What about aluminium? I guess that it will be in the middle between both alternatives, and it could be a possibility. Did you have any comparison that includes this third option for food containers? It could also be great to have this comparison.
Yeah, now aluminium is an interesting option, because I think a number of people will remember from quite some years ago, certainly cooking with aluminium pots was linked to early onset of Alzheimer's disease. So aluminium is not free from concerns, but equally, people will also recognize who use takeaway meals, that sometimes some of those products come in aluminium containers with like a card top. So aluminium has an interesting place because it is one of the materials that has a protective oxide film on its surface, like stainless does, what is known as the passive layer, which is one of the things that helps it resist sort of corrosion, but also to avoid picking up flavors and passing on flavors to other products. And aluminium's light, but the environmental footprint of producing aluminium is not as compelling as that of other metals. So aluminium does sit somewhere in the middle. I think that's a fair point. It's certainly used in drinks cans for cold drinks, and that's well established. But I think when you get to hot products, you have to be a little more careful because of its history being linked to Alzheimer's disease.
When talking about CO2 emissions, are you taking the full scope, so like scope 1, 2, and 3 upstream? And
Yeah.
can we have the sources for this calculation?
So, as a stainless industry, we collect the data for scope 1, 2, and 3, and we sort of publish that every year. So that data is available through our website. And the sources of the alloying materials, which are either scrap or ferroalloys, are that those associations publish their data too. So this information is all out there. We're not trying to hide any of it. It's in our report. I think one of the benefits of stainless steel is the more recycled content you get into the new production, the lower the emissions. It makes perfect sense. And that's one of the beauties of the stainless steel industry. Stainless steels are 100% recyclable. They're infinitely recyclable. And as I said, we capture 95, 96% to make into new stainless steels. So nobody's hiding that data. The associations produce it. And equally, you know, the plastics guys produce theirs. This is in the public domain already.
Okay, and then on a very specific topic, do you have the same LCA comparison between single plastic bottles and stainless steel bottles?
Yes, we do. Yeah, we've done that as well. I didn't want to include too many variants, but one of the things that's interesting about water bottles, single-use plastic bottles versus stainless bottles, is the emissions. Once you start bottling water, your emissions jumps up more than 200 times because you've got 10 processes instead of 4 processes. And that goes back to that sort of earlier question about with the returnsy containers, adding transport. When you think about water from the tap, there are just 4 processes to get water to your tap, whether it be in your office or your home. There are 10 processes to get bottled water, 10 processes to get bottled water to the shelf of the shop. And as a result of that, the emissions goes up dramatically. And that's a scary statistic when you see that. And that was conducted a couple of years ago by a German organization. So we picked up on that as an independent study, and it's very compelling. And I don't know if did we publish that on our website, Joe? I can't remember.
I think it was in one of our previous webinars.
Yes, that's a good
the one
point.
about the containers.
Everlasting bottles and boxes, yes.
Yes, that was the one. So I can dig that up.
Yeah.
And then also very specifically, can the stainless steel trays be microwaved because the food might have gone cold by the time it gets to you?
Yeah, I would never encourage putting any metallic object in a microwave. Microwaves are designed to warm things up by exciting the atoms and molecules in the products, and metals really don't like that, and you'll start getting sparks flying around inside your microwave, and it is possible to set fire to your microwave. So please don't think about that, whether it be a stainless container or an aluminium container. If your food's gone cold, just stick it on a plate or in a bowl and pop that into the microwave. But please don't think about putting a stainless container in a microwave. It is the one downside of metals, but hey, there are other ways of doing it. So
You can
everything.
just stick it in your oven.
Yeah, you can stick it in the oven. Of course you can. Yes, that works as well.
Okay. About that number, 750 times used. This seems very long, and it could be years, you know, before. So
Yeah.
why 750? Why 750?
That's as far as we got before we published this document. So we're still reusing containers to see how far. So based on sort of real life tests, the evidence we've got was 750. We're now sort of almost at 800, and this number just keeps going. And these containers get dropped, they get reused, of course, and the number keeps increasing. So I didn't want to put a number that hadn't been achieved in, even though I think, you know, stainless steel containers that are reasonably well looked after will last a long, long time. We've definitely reached 750 without any problems.
So, and then it says it's kind of the same thing. Can we see pictures of the 750 users?
No, we didn't video it. So I guess I'm asking people to sort of accept that we did those tests, because as somebody rightly said in the previous question, this is a long time. This is years, and indeed it is. It's sort of more than 2 years of testing the same container on a daily basis, and occasionally dropping it as people do. And maybe we should have done a time lapse, but you don't always think about those things until after the event. But there's no doubt, you know, the products will last a long, long time, and even in the hands of young people who may choose to throw them around in the school, they still last a long, long time.
So, and then it says, how many years is it possible to reuse a stainless steel container? Guess.
That's a really good question, because we know that stainless steels in other applications will last over 100 years, and there are examples of that in existence. But for a container, because we've only been testing it, or testing some containers, for a little over 2 years, it's quite difficult to put a sort of endpoint number on, because there's no doubt that when you drop a stainless container, every occasional drop, you'll get a little dent or distortion in the container that doesn't affect its use, it doesn't make it any less serviceable, but that occurs. And at what point do you get so many dents or other imperfections that it's not usable? That's the point we don't know yet. So again, choosing the number 750, which was based on a sort of real set of tests, we felt was okay. And as somebody has correctly said, that's, you know, if the average person uses 134 containers a year, that's clearly a few years. So there are some unanswered questions there, but from our perspective, I don't think you have to look to that many uses to make stainless an interesting alternative. You don't have to look to 750 uses, but having the comfort and the confidence to know it will last with reasonable handling that amount of time, I think is good.